Hi, I'm Akbar, a developer advocate at Figma, and this is Bridging the Gap, where we take a designer and a developer and we try to understand the process behind our collaboration and how we can do this better. I'm here with Anna,
Hi, I'm Anna. I'm a designer advocate at Figma.
and you've been talking a lot about design systems recently. And I really want to understand just kind of what they are and why they're helpful to the designer developer process.
hmm Yeah, so it's hard to pinpoint what exactly a design system is because it looks so different from every company. I generally like to think of design systems as being made up of a combination of people. So the people who are kind of managing the processes, the people who are contributing to it, the tools. So if you're using something like Figma, Storybook, some other kind of development tool to help you manage your design and development assets and documentation. And then there's also the processes. So what are the processes in place to help people contribute to it, to maintain it, to have versioning of it. All of that together makes up a design system, but it looks different kind of from company to company.
Yeah, that's a pretty interesting point. I've never really thought about all of the processes and communication surrounding a design system. Like I've always just thought of like a library and some code. And so it's really interesting to note all those other pieces that it feels like they're pretty instrumental to making a design system work.
Yeah, I try to emphasize that just because, sometimes when I've talked to people who work on design systems, their design system might primarily be like a Figma library or UI kit, and they'll call it their design system. But I try to emphasize that it's so much more than that because, having a series of components and sticker sheets isn't enough to really build everything, and you might not even notice that you have processes in place. Even if it's something super lightweight, like someone just drops in a comment if they made a change or a contribution, that's still a process.
Yeah.
Even if it's, not something that's thoroughly documented and fully governed where everyone strictly follows it, but it's still something.
Yeah, and I think that's a pretty relevant note because not all of teams can support fully documenting or might not even want to, especially if they're like a little smaller, a little scrappier. They might feel like they work a lot better by having that kind of that trust in their process versus like trying to follow something verbatim.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like a lot of teams, I think we're at the point now where people know that design systems exist and that they're valuable. You look at some of the really big companies out there, they all have design systems. And so I think now it's something that a lot of people feel like they have to have because they're like, well, Google has one, Salesforce has one. We should have one too if we want to grow and become a successful company. But then, as you mentioned, it's kind of it's okay for it to be small and scrappy if that's what works for you. I think oftentimes people get bogged down in the details where they're like, I'm just going to fully replicate material design and I'm going to say that I have this amazing design system. And then what happens is they spend all this time building this giant thing and then no one uses it because it's just too much of a change. It's too much to ask of people, or it quickly loses relevance
Yeah.
because your company's just trying to build fast. So it's kind of
Yeah.
why are people so focused on these nitty-gritty details of I'm following all the specs to a T and I'm reading all this documentation? It should just be whatever works for you at whatever point in time, even if it's something small and scrappy. I think as long as it serves whatever fundamental need that you have for it, you just want to be able to build faster. You just want designers and engineers to more easily understand each other, for engineers to be able to look at a design and say, oh, I know everything that already exists. And then I know what are some new things I need to create to really bring this feature to life.
Hmm.
That's great. It doesn't have to be super crazy, a bunch of interlinked libraries, anything like that. Just whatever kind of gets people by.
Yeah, and I think that getting people by part is also pretty important. Like in terms of, I don't want it to be extra work to have to adopt the design system. If it's getting in the way of my process, then it's not really doing its job.
Exactly.
What would you suggest to folks that maybe don't have a design system and are thinking about getting one? Like, how would you approach that?
I'd probably question first, do you really not have a design system? Because, as we mentioned, it could be something really small. Designers, you're going to componentize certain things because you don't want to rebuild it over and over again. I'm sure developers are the same way where it's like, okay, we know we're gonna have the nav bar exist everywhere, so I'm just gonna reuse one that my teammate had already built. Like that is already the beginnings of a component library. And then whatever like lightweight processes you might have for that. Maybe there's like a centralized place where people just kind of keep things there for others to reference. Yeah, it's very possible you already have a design system and you don't know that it's there yet, or you just haven't like given it that label. For teams that are looking to start a design system, I feel like this is normally the mentality that organizations have when they reach a certain point where they're like, okay, the lightweight thing that we have now isn't working. We've kind of got like a lot of cleanup and debt that's accrued in our processes. Like, you know, as companies grow, it's harder for people to know where's that central source of truth.
Yeah.
There might end up being multiple sources of truth because you have multiple teams. And so it's more of like an opportunity for an organization to take a step back, clean things up, create a centralized place for everyone to reference, to help solve kind of the issues that and growing pains that happen as you get bigger. And I think like when teams are starting to do that, that's then when I think it makes a lot of sense to, look at other organizations that you aspire to be like, or other organizations that maybe had similar problems to your own, and see how they approach building their design system. And maybe there's certain like strategies that you can try to replicate as you think about implementing your own. I definitely would want to be cautious about blindly copying things because, like every design system has a different purpose.
Yeah.
The way that someone built theirs might not necessarily make sense for your own. And I think the more that you put into it, the harder it is to manage. So the larger your library is, just the more that there is to maintain. So always being cautious of how big do we really need this to be? How comprehensive do we need this to be? Do we really need to create components of absolutely every single tiny element of our product that exists today? Or do we really just want to get a couple of core things and just give people general guidance around, if you want to build and create a new experience, here's some things you can follow to make it feel like it's a part of the same product or experience or suite, but still not kind of slow them down and bog them in the details, and also not bog you down with, if you have a team, spending every single day just going through different tasks and trying to work your way through them.
So this concept of a design system, it seems really similar to like something that developers do, which is like creating reusable patterns, reusable components. And I'm really curious, like, because it feels like such a developer concept, is there often some friction getting designers to use design systems?
I feel like a lot of times I haven't seen a ton of more resistance from designers than engineers to adopt a design system. I do think probably one potential angle around why maybe you could see designers being a little more resistant to that would be designers are creative people. They don't want to be hindered. They don't want to be constantly told, no, you can't do this because we already have an existing pattern. So you just have to like drag and drop things and that's how you design, because it's not really, it takes the creativity out of it. It also prevents people from really building the best experience out there. So I think that could be a reason why maybe designers are a little more resistant to that.
In that creativity space, like, is there a world in which having a design system allows you to be more creative?
I think so. I think there's a balance. So the time-saving aspect of design systems is normally you have foundations like colors, iconography, corner radius, drop shadows, those basic things that should be consistent to just give wherever part of your product that someone is in, give that the same vibe and feel.
Yeah.
Also, like, I mean, how creative do I have to be to figure out what color to apply to an icon? Is that really something that I think really gets my creative juices flowing? Probably not. So it's a balance. Usually teams will focus on just setting that foundation. Maybe a couple of like really small atomic basic components like buttons, tabs, little things. Those can be defined and componentized not only because they're used a lot, but also because I can't imagine a designer who's designing a brand new flow
Yeah.
being like, I really want to change that button, unless if there's something, you know, really specific about this design where the button's super important. And then giving designers the flexibility of, okay, figuring out how do I use these foundational pieces and then build off of that. I've also seen teams where they'll have kind of like basic pattern outlines.
Yeah.
Or it's like, here is like a card. It is going to have like this padding, this corner radius. There's always going to be maybe like a close icon in the top right corner. But as for the kinds of things you can put in here, there's a lot of flexibility there that you can work with. And so you can customize it to, you know, whatever is the given use case that you're trying to solve for. So those are a couple of approaches that teams can take to, finding the balance between saving people time, not asking them to sweat unnecessary details, so they can focus more on like the problem solving aspect of building products.
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense, where it's just like, how many times do you have to think about making like a card or making like a list, where those things you probably want to keep pretty much the same. And then you get to focus on a bit more of the creative problems, like the things that are a bit more one-off, where you get to really stretch those creative muscles. I'm really curious, are there benefits for developers when a designer is using a design system in Figma?
100%, assuming that there is a one-to-one between the two. I've talked to some teams where their design systems team is started by designers. And like, it's, you know, it's one of those things that, as I said, it can happen very naturally. Like, you know, some designers, they're like, oh, we're constantly rebuilding like the same thing. So let's just turn that into a component, have this centralized library where designers can now drag and drop. At a certain point, maybe they're like, okay, let's go through, clean this up, create a bit more process now that our team is bigger so everyone can stay on the same page. But then usually what happens is then they say, now we have a design system and now we have a design system team, but there's now engineers on that team. It's kind of like maybe the design process is faster for these designers now because it's, you know, there's more cohesive. They have people on their team they can reach out to for guidance. But then once you get to the handoff stage for engineers, if there's no corresponding code components, or the components in code are named differently from the components in the Figma design file, then it's kind of like you're gonna expect there to be some differences between the end experience that the engineer creates and the design that you envisioned. And I think that's where a lot of frustrations happen for people, as they're like, well, I gave this to you and then it looks totally different. Using a design system is really helpful for designers if there is that equivalent for engineers. Like if you have variables in Figma, have those directly mapped to design tokens in code. If you have components and patterns in Figma, have those mapped to components and patterns that engineers are pulling from in code. And also, like, when you create that connection and really make sure that they map one-to-one, not only are engineers going to better understand, okay, here's like the exact components I know I need to use, but also like they can better understand when a designer made a change, right? So like, for instance, like in Code Connect or even like dev mode, when you're inspecting, you can see if a designer detached a component. And that's kind of like an easy way to flag to an engineer that if the designer, something's different here, and either they need to like change the component or they need to make something new. So that kind of thing is just a quick signal. I imagine it just makes it easier for the engineer to like estimate how long a project is going to take, because then they can kind of quickly analyze, okay, what's already there for me to use versus what do I need to start building custom.
Yeah, it's also pretty helpful when the design system is in Figma, being able to like identify, especially if there's code associated with it, being able to identify like, okay, they're using this button component and it might be named the same thing in our documentation. It makes it a lot easier for me to find. And one thing that, like, I think the core of it is like, we want to make it easier for us to build something. And so like it's really important to have that basis in both design and in code, and understanding the needs and the experiences of each of those. Because we were talking about what that designer experience looks like, and then when we're thinking about the developer experience, like one thing that happens a lot in Figma that we don't necessarily see in code is like in Figma we're showing a lot of different representative states, of a component. So like let's take a button. In a button component, we might see all the different states, like a hover state, a disabled state, a focus state, and a lot of that stuff, if we're using components, gets encapsulated. So like a hover state and a focus state is not something that I usually need to explicitly specify when I have a button component, but I might need to know about the disabled state, or I might need to be able to pull out some of the props that you're using in Figma, like the size variant, etc., but rely on good defaults so that I don't have to write as much code for the same repeatable patterns. And that, I think that's something that it's really important to have that conversation between design and engineering to figure out what those defaults are and to figure out where that disconnect is in terms of how you're building a component in design and whether or not that thing is feasible and how useful it is compared to the code component. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, we want to be able to build something. So we can't just have a design pattern that has no basis in code, and vice versa. We can't just have a code component that doesn't have any basis in the design.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I think too, a lot of designers probably don't realize, I definitely didn't realize initially, that a lot of the design system features and concepts in Figma came from code first. So components existed in code before we called them that in Figma, like properties as well. Those are rooted in code. Auto layout is based on Flexbox. And then, yeah, I mean, obviously variables came from design tokens and code. So it's like they kind of exist in Figma. It's not 100% perfect though, I think, because Figma was originally built for a designer audience and not developer. So yeah, there is like a way to create that alignment, but there's definitely points where it's like, yeah, like if a component already has built-in states for a developer, they don't need that defined, but for a designer, I still need to be able to switch it out to build my prototype.
Yeah.
Definitely like being able to figure out where can we align?
Yeah.
And then if there's differences, right, like how do you document them?
Yeah. And I think that's something that really helps here is like we've been experimenting a bit with Code Connect, where we're able to kind of bridge that gap in terms of keeping the designer experience the same without having it affect the developer experience. So we can pull in those states and we can define in code exactly which one of those we need and ignore any of those that we don't have to use, and also include properties in code that are relevant to code but may not have any meaning in design. And so you're not having extra properties that you have to deal with as a designer, and as an engineer I don't have to think about like things like Boolean states that exist in Figma to make it easy for you to toggle on and off whether or not something exists, but is not as relevant for us in code.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Some of like the code properties are related to behavior, right? Which is stuff that a designer probably wouldn't necessarily, I mean, you could think about it as a designer, but it's definitely not something I think most people prioritize.
Yeah, so like the example that I like to use is there's something called like a click handler or a press handler. And so my component might have like an on press, which is where I'm going to be doing a lot of my work, where I define a function that's going to trigger when that button is pressed. And all of that behavior exists in code, but like you said, there's no real signal for that. There's no real like representation of that in Figma. And so it's not really necessary for that thing to exist in the design component, but it's something that we definitely need in code. And so being able to have both without us getting in the way of each other, I think is really valuable. Now, before we close out, one thing that I'm really curious about is, do you have a tip for our audience on something that one thing that you wish that they knew about working with designers?
So one thing that developers should know about working with designers, that question is phrased in a way where it feels like engineers only have things to learn about design, when I feel like it goes both ways. Honestly, like I don't think it's a matter of understanding. I think it's more like people just need to know how to talk to each other and like how to communicate ideas. Like for instance, designers are very visual people. So I think definitely encouraging developers to maybe use like the design system as a way to quickly mock up like thoughts. Like if a design that a designer gives you isn't feasible for whatever reason, being able to like quickly mock up alternatives. So rather than saying it's not possible to do this, being able to say, we can't do this for this reason, but here's some other possibilities. Let's maybe talk through it and figure out what you think is best. And then likewise for designers to engineers, maybe like figuring out what's the best way if you want them to use, like if they want you to use annotations to drop in notes, call out certain things, figure out, how can you best prepare your design to really help them understand everything. Like, is prototyping helpful? Is having a screenshot of every single possible state, a screen, is that the most helpful thing? Like, it really depends on the person. So I think it's about working with that person, understanding kind of how they speak,
Mm.
what kind of language works best with them, and then, yeah, adjusting the way that you communicate to suit that.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us, Anna. And this was Bridging the Gap, and we hope to see you in the next episode.